In the 41st millennium, order is not given. It is bled for, screamed into existence across 1,000,000 dying worlds, and maintained only through the iron will of those ruthless enough to demand it. The Imperium of man endures because someone, 10,000 years ago, looked upon the chaos of a galaxy burning and chose to write the rules by which civilization would survive. But what if that someone never got the chance? What if the single document that defined humanity's military might, for 10 millennia, the Codex Astartes, was never written? What if the hand that held the quill was stilled before the first word could be inscribed? The consequences don't ripple outward. They detonate. If you hunger for stories that crack the foundations of the 41st millennium and ask the questions that keep inquisitors awake at night, unsmash that subscribe button, because the Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. The Medicae bay aboard the Macraga's Honor smelled of counterseptic fluid, burning glow sticks, and something else, something sweeter and more terrible. Apothecaries moved in tight, urgent clusters around the central slab, their white armor stained in colors it should never have worn. Bioxenic monitors screamed steady warnings. Servo skulls hovered and retreated, their sensor arrays overwhelmed by readings that defied biological logic. On the slab lay Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord of Ultramar, and by any honest accounting, the last architect of the Imperium's future. Fulgrim's blade had done its work with characteristic elegance. The venom, refined from sources that existed nowhere in Imperial taxonomy, distilled in the laboratories of Slaanesh's most devoted servant, had entered the Primarch's bloodstream not as a crude poison, but as a philosophical argument. It did not kill. It unraveled. It found the electrical pathways that governed Guilliman's post-human physiology and rewrote them, slowly and with terrible patience, into something approaching stillness. Chief Apothecary Empyon had not slept in 6 days. His hands, steady enough to reconstruct gene seed under artillery fire, now trembled as he reviewed the latest auger scans. "My lord," he addressed Marneus Calgar, who stood at the foot of the slab like a monument to controlled grief. "The progression is accelerating. Whatever compound Fulgrim used, it responds to counteragents by mutating. Every treatment we deploy becomes the vector for the next phase of degradation." Calgar said nothing for a long moment. Around him, the ship groaned through the warp, its Geller field holding back the howling dark by faith and mathematics alone. "Options," Calgar said finally. 1. Empyon pulled up a hololithic display. "Stasis, immediate and indefinite. We freeze the progression before it reaches the cerebral cortex. The Lord Primarch survives, but in suspension, dormant." He paused. "There's no timeline for recovery. It could be decades. It could be—" "Do it," Calgar said. "My lord, the Primarch has matters unfinished. He spoke of a document, a codification of—" "I know what he spoke of." Calgar's voice carried the weight of a man choosing between two catastrophes. "I was there when he dictated the first passages. 47 pages. Not enough." He turned from the slab. "If we do not place him in stasis now, there will be no Primarch to complete anything. Proceed." Empyon nodded and turned to his work. Across the ship, in a private strategium sealed by 3 cipher locks, A data slate sat on a campaign table. 47 pages of dense military philosophy, tactical doctrine, and post-heresy restructuring burned on its screen. The cursor blinked at the end of the last sentence, waiting. It would wait for a very long time. The stasis field activated at the 3rd hour of the watch. Guilliman's chest stopped mid-breath, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and his expression carrying something between resolution and frustration. The face of a man interrupted mid-sentence by the universe's most inconvenient timing. The monitors flatlined into steady, artificial silence. In the strategium, unread and incomplete, the 47 pages sat in the dark. And across the Imperium, 10,000 space marines and a dozen legions continued their wars, their campaigns, and their feuds and their crusades, without the slightest idea that the document meant to restructure everything they were, had just been quietly, permanently delayed. The legions would not be broken into chapters. The Primarchs who survived would not be asked to stand down. The second founding would not happen as history intended. Humanity had just inherited a very different future. The news reached Terra in the way that all catastrophic news reached Terra, slowly, badly, and already too late to change anything. 40 days after Guilliman's stasis, the High Lords convened in the Senatorum Imperialis, beneath the shadow of the Golden Throne. 12 figures of immense political weight arranged themselves around a table built for decisions that killed millions and stared at one another with the particular expression of people who have just realized the person who held everything together is no longer in the room. Fabricator General Zagreus Kane spoke first, because he always did. The Codex is incomplete. He let the words settle like a demolition charge. 47 pages, structural framework without implementation, philosophy without mechanism. The Lord Primarch outlined the intention to restructure the legions. He did not complete the methodology, the succession protocols, or the chapter delineations. "Then we complete it," said Lord Commander Militant Anatolis Weiss, a man who had survived 3 wars and 2 assassination attempts by treating every problem as a logistics equation. Guilliman's senior staff have access to his notes. His thinking is documented. We extrapolate. "You cannot extrapolate a Primarch," said Inquisitorial Representative Legate Corovane, her tone carrying the cold precision of someone who had spent 40 years dismantling things that other people assumed were stable. His strategic architecture operates on cognitive levels our finest minds cannot replicate. Every attempt to complete his work without him risks producing something that resembles the Codex while functioning as its opposite. Silence. "Then we table the restructuring," Weiss said carefully. "Temporarily." "Temporarily," Corovane repeated, with the inflection of someone who understood that temporary in imperial politics meant forever. What followed in the next decade was not chaos. That would come later. What followed first was something almost more dangerous: freedom. The surviving loyalist Primarchs, absent Guilliman's authority and the Codex's mandate, retained full command of their legions. On paper, they answered to Terra. In practice, they answered to their own judgment, their own campaigns, and their own increasingly divergent visions of what the Imperium should become. Rogel Dorn and his Imperial fists remained closest to Terra, their legion swelling with fresh recruitment, their fortification projects expanding across the Sol system with a scope that made the High Lords quietly nervous. Dorn was loyal, no one doubted that, but a loyal man commanding 300,000 Space Marines was still 300,000 Space Marines. Jagatai Khan took his white scars into the eastern fringe and essentially disappeared, his legion moving at speeds that made Imperial tracking a polite fiction. Dispatches arrived months late, describing victories in systems the High Lords hadn't officially sanctioned campaigns in. The Khan sent acknowledgments of their concern that somehow managed to be both respectful and completely dismissive. Leman Russ was the loudest problem. The Space Wolves had never been comfortable with the concept of restriction, and without the Codex's limitations on legion size, Russ had spent the decade recruiting at a pace that alarmed every Mechanicus geneticist assigned to monitor the gene seed stocks. He'd also begun making noise in the blunt, unconcealed way that was either his greatest strength or his most infuriating characteristic, about finishing the job in the eye of terror. "We left traitors breathing," he said, in a recorded Vox transmission to the Senatorum that had been played back 17 times by analysts trying to determine whether it constituted a threat. "The Khan runs, Dorn builds walls, and we sit here pretending the heresy ended because we stopped counting the dead. It didn't end. We just stopped fighting." The High Lords filed the transmission under concerning, monitor closely, and did nothing. Because doing something about Leman Russ required either Guilliman or another Primarch willing to stand across from the Wolf King and tell him no. Neither was available. It was into this precarious equilibrium that Lionel Johnson arrived. The Primarch of the Dark Angels had been absent since the heresy's closing stages. His whereabouts a matter of speculation that the Dark Angels Legion deflected with the practiced ease of people who had been deflecting questions for a very long time. When his flagship, the Invincible Reason, translated into Terra's orbit without prior announcement or Vox hail, the defense batteries had come within 11 seconds of opening fire. Johnson walked into the Senatorum Imperialis as though he owned it, which, given the size of the legion at his back, was not entirely a metaphor. He surveyed the assembled High Lords with his characteristic expression, patient, calculating, and faintly contemptuous of anyone who hadn't already understood what he was about to say. Guilliman's vision was containment, he said, without preamble. He wanted to break the legions because he feared what unified command could become. He was not wrong to fear it, a pause that landed with deliberate weight. He was wrong about the solution. He placed a document on the table. Not 47 pages, 312. "I've had time to think," said the Lion. The document Lionel Johnson placed before the High Lords had no official title. The Dark Angels Legion Master, who had compiled its index, a taciturn Astartes named Albrecht, who communicated primarily through marginal annotations, had labeled it internally as the Johnson Protocols. The Lion himself referred to it simply as the alternative. It was, in the most charitable reading, a masterwork of military philosophy. In a less charitable reading, It was a blueprint for permanent Primarch authority dressed in the language of administrative reform. Where Guilliman's incomplete codex had argued for division, break the legions, distribute power, prevent any single commander from holding forces capable of challenging Terra, the Lion's doctrine argued for consolidation under a unified military council, 7 Primarchs, 7 legions at full strength, a permanent war cabinet with authority over imperial military strategy that would answer to the Emperor's throne, bypassing the High Lords entirely on matters of campaign and deployment. "You are describing a military junta," said Legate Coravain on page 40 of her review. "I am describing an efficient one," the Lion replied. "The debates lasted 3 months. They were, by all accounts, extraordinary. The kind of political arguments that only happen when the participants are both brilliant and completely unwilling to concede anything. Johnson was patient in the way that apex predators are patient, entirely still until the moment he wasn't. He answered every objection with a counter-argument that had clearly been prepared in advance, which was either impressive foresight or evidence that he'd been planning this for longer than he admitted. Rogal Dorn said nothing publicly for 6 weeks. Then he released a single-page response that demolished the command structure of the Johnson protocols in 4 paragraphs and proposed instead a modified codex completion, hiring the finest strategic minds in the Imperium to extrapolate Guilliman's framework under Dorn's editorial authority. The Lion read Dorn's response, filed it, and invited Dorn to dinner aboard the Invincible Reason. Dorn declined. Across the Imperium, the legions watched their Primarchs argue and drew their own conclusions. In the Ultramarines Legion, Marneus Calgar had taken de facto command with the quiet, terrible competence of a man who understood that the alternative was someone less careful filling the vacuum. He had access to Guilliman's 47 pages and had read them so many times that he could recite them verbatim in 3 languages. He understood, better than anyone alive, what Guilliman had been building toward, and he understood, equally, that he lacked the authority to implement it unilaterally. So he implemented what he could, quietly. The Ultramarines began operating in self-sufficient, company-sized formations. Supply chains were restructured. Tactical doctrines were codified at the chapter level without being called chapters. Calgar was building the skeleton of the Codex from the inside, hoping that when Guilliman eventually woke, he insisted to himself, never, if, there would be something to attach the flesh to. Whether Guilliman would wake in time to matter was a question Calgar did not permit himself to answer honestly. It was Leman Russ who broke the deadlock, as Leman Russ tended to break most things, loudly, physically, and without particular concern for the political consequences. He didn't wait for the Senatorum's authorization. He didn't formally notify the Lion or Dorn. He sent a single Vox message to Terra. "We're going in, try to keep up," and translated the Space Wolves Legion into the warp on a heading for the Eye of Terror. 41 ships, 90,000 Space Marines. The largest single military force the Imperium had committed to a single theater since the heresy itself. The High Lords convened an emergency session within hours. "He can't simply," Vice began. "He has," Coravain said. We must recall him. With what authority? The codex that would have established clear command hierarchy was never completed. Legally, a Legion Primarch answers to the Emperor. The Emperor is... She stopped herself. Russ has identified a gap in our governance structure and walked through it with 90,000 heavily armed witnesses. The Lion, attending via hololithic projection, said nothing. But something moved behind his eyes that those who knew him well would have recognized as satisfaction, not at Russ's action specifically, but at the proof his protocols provided. This, his expression said, is precisely what happens without unified command. Dorn's response, again delivered in writing, was characteristically blunt. Russ is wrong in method. He is not wrong in instinct. The eye of terror remains an open wound. The question is not whether we address it, but whether we do so with strategy or with fury. Privately, in the Phalanx's strategium, Dorn had already begun drafting contingency plans for a coordinated assault, the kind of campaign that would require multiple legions, unified command, and the exact political authority that nobody currently possessed. He filed the plans under contingent, awaiting resolution of current idiocy, and returned to fortifying Luna. In the eye of terror, the traitor legions received the first augur returns of an incoming armada and began, for the first time in a decade, to take the loyalists seriously again. In the webway, ancient Eldar seers cast their runes and read the future with growing alarm. Something that should have been contained was now accelerating. The Eye of Terror did not welcome the Space Wolves. Nothing about that roiling wound in reality was designed for welcome. It was designed for consumption, for the slow erosion of certainty and sanity, until whatever entered emerged as something fundamentally different from what it had been. 10,000 traitor Astartes had learned this. 10,000 demons called it home. Leman Russ had been here before. He remembered the way it tasted, copper and ozone, and something older than language. He remembered the way the warp bled through the veil here, making augur returns unreliable and vox communications into exercises in creative interpretation. He remembered all of it, and he'd come back anyway. But because Leman Russ's relationship with things that wanted to kill him was fundamentally one of enthusiasm. The first 3 weeks were, by his standards, straightforward. The Space Wolves hit the demon world of Charis with the coordinated ferocity of a legion that had spent a decade sharpening itself on smaller campaigns. Drop pods fell like hammers. Thunderhawks carved low atmospheric runs, while Fenrisian warpacks moved through the ash rock terrain with the fluid efficiency of something that had evolved specifically to hunt in hostile environments. The demon garrison, a mixed force of Kornate and Sinchian entities that would have annihilated any force smaller than a full legion, was obliterated in 11 hours. Russ surveyed the aftermath from a ridge of fused glass that had once been a shrine to something that shouldn't be named, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like himself again. Another, he told his wolf guard, meaning another world, another target, another step deeper into the eye. They went deeper. What Russ did not account for, what his instinct-driven strategic calculus had set aside in favor of the purity of forward momentum, was that the traitor legions had also spent a decade preparing. They had watched the loyalists argue. They had monitored the political paralysis on Terra through agents embedded at levels that would have caused mass executions if discovered. They had read the absence of the Codex not as a crisis, but as an opportunity, because an Imperium of unbroken legions operating without unified command doctrine was an Imperium of potential fault lines. In the Daemon world fortress of Medrengard, Perturabo received the reports of Russ's incursion and did something that surprised even his closest Iron Warriors officers. He smiled. "They've sent a hammer," he said, studying the tactical display with the attention of an engineer examining a load-bearing structure for weaknesses. No anvil, no coordinated follow-through, no secondary forces positioned to exploit gains or cover retreat. He traced the Space Wolves' projected advance with one armored finger. Russ is brilliant at destruction. He always was, but destruction without architecture is just rubble. He turned to his assembled war council, grim, scarred figures whose augmentations had long since crossed the line between enhancement and transformation. "We don't fight the wolves," Perturabo said. "We redirect them." The plan he outlined was elegant in the particular way that Iron Warriors' plans were always elegant. Not beautiful, but structurally sound, load-tested against every foreseeable variable, and utterly merciless in its exploitation of the opposition's assumptions. Russ would be allowed to advance. His victories would be real. The Space Wolves would push deeper into the eye, achieving genuine military objectives, and with each advance, they would become more isolated, more overextended, and more dependent on supply lines that the Iron Warriors would then systematically dismantle. Not a trap, a compression chamber. Russ felt it on the 31st day, not through augur returns or intelligence reports. His rune priests had been screaming warnings through the warp for a week, their visions fragmented but consistent in emotional tone. But through the particular instinct that had kept him alive through 100 campaigns, where the odds had argued against his survival, something was wrong with the shape of the war. He called his wolf lords together in the flagship's great hall, where pelts of creatures that had no names in Low Gothic hung between Legion banners, and Fenrisian ale that had survived the journey through the warp sat untouched in its flagons. "They're not fighting back properly," he said. Gunner Red Moon, his most tactically precise wolf lord, had been thinking the same thing. "Resistance is too light on our eastern flank. They're pulling forces back rather than contesting. Either they can't hold, or they don't want to," Russ finished. Silence settled over the assembled wolf lords. "We're being led somewhere," said Russ. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded the way he always sounded when the hunt became genuinely interesting. "Question is whether we follow, pull back, or something else entirely." What made Leman Russ dangerous, what had always made him dangerous, was that his instincts operated faster than most men's deliberate thought. He was already reaching the answer before he'd finished asking the question, and they needed support. Not because the Space Wolves couldn't fight. They could always fight. But because Perturabo's plan, whatever it was, had been built around the assumption that the Space Wolves were alone. The solution was to not be alone. He drafted a Vox message to Dorn. Then he drafted one to the Lion. Then he paused, looked at both, and sent them simultaneously with a note that read, "Stop arguing and come help. Bring everyone." It was the most strategically sophisticated communication Leman Russ had produced in a decade. On Terra, it landed like a grenade in the middle of the Senatorum's ongoing constitutional crisis. Dorn read Russ's message twice. The second reading was not because he'd failed to understand it. Dorn processed information with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had turned comprehension itself into a martial discipline. But because he wanted to be certain, he wasn't misreading the subtext. He wasn't. The subtext was simple. Russ was in trouble and too proud to say so directly, which meant the situation was significantly worse than the message implied. Dorn pulled up his contingency files, the ones labeled contingent, awaiting resolution of current idiocy. He opened them, reviewed them for 17 minutes, made 4 amendments, and then did something that the High Lords of Terra would later describe, depending on their political alignment, as either decisive leadership or unilateral insubordination. He activated them. Within 6 hours, the Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery, a vessel so vast that smaller ships had been known to mistake it for a space station, began powering its warp drives. 3 full companies were already embarked. Dorn sent dispatches to his scattered Legion forces with coordinates and a timeline that left no room for debate. Then he sent a single message to Lionel Johnson. "I am going. The wolves need an anvil. You know I'm right. Stop performing and decide." The Lion received the message aboard the Invincible Reason, read it once, and then handed it to Albrecht without expression. "Prepare the Legion," he said. Albrecht made a notation in the margin of whatever document he was currently annotating. "And the protocols?" "The protocols will still be true when we return." Johnson moved to the viewport, where the stars of the Sol system burned in their patient configurations. They Russ charging blindly into the Eye of Terror, while Dorn builds the strategic framework to exploit it. This is either the worst accident in post-heresy history, or the beginning of something functional. He paused. "I am not certain which. Either way, I intend to be present." On Terra, the High Lords watched 3 Primarchs mobilize simultaneously toward the Eye of Terror and experienced the specific political vertigo of people who have theoretically supreme authority and practically none whatsoever. Coravane called it correctly, as she usually did. We can object, or we can get ahead of it. Those are the options. They got ahead of it. Emergency authorization was drafted, backdated slightly to preserve the fiction of institutional control, and a formal campaign designation was assigned: Operation Cerberus. Supply chains were activated. Navy assets were redirected. The Mechanicus Forge worlds adjacent to the campaign theater were notified to expect requisition demands of a scale not seen since the heresy itself. It looked, on paper, like coordinated Imperial strategy. It was, in reality, the 3 Primarchs doing what they intended to do anyway, while the Senatorum performed the administrative equivalent of running to the front of a parade it hadn't organized. Perturabo received confirmation of the incoming Loyalist forces and revised his assessment without visible frustration. This was the mark of a truly exceptional military mind. Not the absence of setbacks, but the speed and quality of adaptation when they arrived. "3 legions," said his senior siege master, a veteran named Harcourt, whose augmetic left arm contained more computational processing power than most Imperial battle cogitators. Wolves already engaged, fists and dark angels inbound. Combined strength approaches 250,000 Astartes. "Approaches," Perturabo noted. "They are not coordinated. They have no unified command doctrine. 3 Primarchs with 3 strategic philosophies will not automatically function as a single force." He moved to the tactical display and began restructuring his dispositions with the calm efficiency of someone rearranging furniture. Russ attacks, Dorn consolidates, the Lion maneuvers. They will complement each other accidentally and conflict with each other deliberately. The gaps between their approaches are where we operate. He began issuing orders. Simultaneously, he sent dispatches into the deeper eye, to addresses that represented alliances so unlikely they had required years of careful cultivation. Because Perturabo, in the decades since the heresy, had been doing something that none of the loyalist Primarchs had predicted. He had been making friends. The first indication that something unprecedented was developing came when Space Wolves augur teams registered an energy signature that didn't match any Iron Warrior's configuration in their recognition files. It was larger, different in frequency, architecturally distinct. Russ's senior rune priest, a weathered veteran named Aldrich, who had been reading the warp since before the heresy, sat with the data for 10 minutes and then requested an immediate audience with the Wolf King. "The signature," Aldrich said carefully. "It matches archived records, pre-heresy survey data from the outer systems." He paused. "It matches Night Lord's fleet configurations." Russ went very still. The Night Lords, Conrad Kurz's Legion of Terror and Psychological Warfare, who had vanished into the eye's deeper regions after the heresy's conclusion, who had spent a decade doing what Night Lords always did, surviving in darkness, feeding on fear, and nurturing grudges with the patience of predators that measured time and suffering rather than seconds. Perturabo had not simply planned a military trap. He had built a coalition, the Iron Warrior's siege expertise, the Night Lord's terror warfare, forces that had spent 10 years developing independent combat doctrines in the Eye's hostile environment, now being coordinated by the most methodical military mind among the traitor Primarchs, against 3 loyalist legions who had never formally agreed on a chain of command. Russ looked at the augur returns and felt the shape of the war shift again, this time into something that demanded he be smarter than he preferred to be. He opened a Vox channel to Dorn's flagship directly. No intermediaries, no posturing. "Rogel," he said, "I need you to be in charge." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds, an eternity for a Primarch. "I know," Dorn said. I've been waiting for you to realize it." Command, among Primarchs, was not a thing that was simply assigned. It was negotiated through a complex architecture of pride, capability, and the particular mathematics of who would follow whom, without the arrangement fracturing under pressure. Guilliman had understood this. His incomplete codex had addressed it in the 47th page, the last one written, in a passage that Calgar had memorized with the reverence of Scripture. Unity of command is not the suppression of individual excellence. It is the channeling of it towards singular purpose. Dorn understood this too, in his own way. He had none of Guilliman's philosophical elegance, but he had something equally valuable: the structural engineer's instinct for load distribution. He knew which pillars could bear weight and which would crack under it. He gave Russ the vanguard, not because it was the most prestigious position. It wasn't in a siege context. But because Russ in the vanguard was Russ doing what Russ did best, which meant Russ was not in a command tent arguing about strategy. He gave the Lion the eastern flank and the intelligence operation, which suited Johnson's preference for information advantage and kept his tendency toward unilateral action pointed at the enemy rather than at his allies. Dorn took the center, the anvil, as he'd described it to the Lion, the fixed point around which the fluid elements of the campaign could orient themselves. It was not the Codex. It was not doctrine. It was improvised architecture, load-tested in real time against a coalition of traitors who had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment. It held, barely. The first major engagement came at the fortified moon of Scalathrex, an Iron Warriors installation that Perturabo had spent 7 years converting from a dead rock into something that combined the functions of fortress, manufactorum, and psychological weapon. Its outer skin was plated with the hulls of loyalist ships destroyed during the heresy. Its internal corridors were engineered to funnel attackers into kill zones that reset automatically. Its void shields were layered in configurations that standard Imperial siege doctrine took an average of 3 weeks to breach. Dorn breached the outer shields in 4 days. This was not because he was smarter than standard Imperial doctrine. He had helped write standard Imperial doctrine, but because he had access to information the doctrine's authors hadn't possessed. Specifically, he had a Dark Angel's intelligence report, delivered by the Lion with characteristic timing, that identified 3 structural vulnerabilities in Scalathrex' shield geometry that Perturabo had deliberately left as apparent weaknesses. Apparent. The Lion's report came with a secondary analysis. These are not oversights. They are invitations. Recommend we RSVP with something unexpected. Dorn had spent a day considering what unexpected meant in this context. Then he'd done something that Perturabo, by his own later admission in documents recovered centuries afterward, had not predicted. He'd ignored all 3 vulnerabilities entirely and hit the 4th wall. The one that looked structurally sound because it was structurally sound, but whose soundness depended on the assumption that attackers would be attempting to breach, rather than to simply apply sustained, catastrophically disproportionate force to a single point until the mathematics stopped working in the defender's favor. Imperial Fist's siege methodology, stripped to its philosophical core, was this: everything breaks if you hit it hard enough in exactly the right place for exactly long enough. The art was in the patience. Scalathrex' 4th wall took 11 days. When it gave completely. Inside the moon, the space wolves poured through the breach with a violence that stripped the engagement of any pretense of tactical nuance. Russ led from the front. He always led from the front, so a habit that made his senior officers age prematurely. And the fighting in Scalathrex' corridors became the kind of close-quarters nightmare that favored aggression over planning. The Iron Warriors fell back in good order, contesting every corridor, every junction, every chamber with the grim professionalism of warriors who understood that their job was not to win this engagement, but to make it expensive. They succeeded. The Space Wolves took casualties at a rate that Dorn's tactical cogitators flagged as unsustainable for extended operations. Russ noticed. He pulled his Wolf Lords back from the deepest corridors, not retreating, reconfiguring, and let Dorn's Imperial fists cycle forward with their methodical room-clearing approach. It was the smoothest tactical handoff between two Primarchs in the entire campaign, achieved entirely through Vox communication and mutual professional respect, rather than any formal command protocol. The Lion, monitoring from orbit, noted it in a dispatch to his own Legion officers. Observe. Competence finding its own level. This is what Guilliman was trying to build with doctrine. They have discovered it through necessity instead. The Night Lords hit the eastern flank 3 days into Scalathrax's clearing operation, and they came without augur warning. The Night Lords had always been exceptional at moving in electromagnetic shadow. And they came not as a military force, but as a terror weapon. Strike teams of 12 to 20 Astartes materialized inside Dark Angel's positions through breaching charges placed in advance by infiltrators who had been in position for weeks. The fighting was savage, intimate, and psychologically calibrated. The Night Lords killed efficiently, but more importantly, they killed loudly, ensuring that the sounds and evidence of each engagement reached maximum distribution through the Loyalist Vox network. They were not trying to win engagements. They were trying to make the Loyalists afraid. It worked on the Imperial Army auxiliary forces attached to the campaign. It did not work on the Dark Angels. The Lion had anticipated psychological warfare. He had, after all, they spent time in the Dark Angel's own complicated history navigating the particular shame of the fallen, an internal trauma that had inoculated his legion through suffering against external terror. His warriors had been afraid of things that could not be shot. Night Lords, whatever their considerable gifts, could be shot. The Dark Angel's counterattack was precise, pre-planned, and revealed that the Lion had been tracking the Night Lord's infiltration teams for 9 days without acting, waiting until he had identified enough of them to make the response definitive rather than merely reactive. Across the eastern flank, 47 Night Lord strike teams were hit simultaneously. 31 of them were destroyed completely. In the deeper eye, Conrad Kurz received the reports and felt something he rarely felt, not fear, something adjacent to it, respect. The campaign for Scalathrax lasted 43 days. When it ended, the Loyalist legions stood in the ruins of Perturabo's masterwork and took stock of what they had become in the process of taking it. They had not become unified. That would be too clean, too convenient a narrative for 3 Primarchs whose philosophical differences ran deeper than tactical disagreements. But they had become something perhaps more durable, calibrated. Each had learned the precise weight and shape of the other's capabilities, the exact points where cooperation was possible, and the exact points where friction was inevitable. They had developed, through 43 days of enforced proximity and shared crisis, a working grammar of joint operations that no doctrine had mandated and no codex had prescribed. Dorn called it functional. Russ called it good enough. The lion called it a beginning and meant something different by it than either of them understood. The costs were significant. 11,000 space wolves dead or critically wounded, 4,000 Imperial fists, 2,000 Dark Angels, though the Lion's casualty reports had a history of precision that his allies found either admirably accurate or suspiciously convenient, depending on their mood. The Iron Warriors and Night Lords had taken comparable losses, but retained the strategic advantage of fighting on home territory in a theater that replenished their forces through means the Loyalists preferred not to examine too closely. Perturabo had lost Scalathrex. He had not lost the war. He had, if his calculations were correct, and Perturabo's calculations were almost always correct, gained something more valuable than a fortified moon. He had gained data. The argument happened on the Phalanx, which Dorn had designated as the campaign's operational headquarters, with the casual authority of a man who understood that whoever controlled the room controlled the agenda. Russ arrived with 3 Wolf Lords and a flagon of Fenrisian ale that he placed on the strategic table without asking whether this was appropriate. The lion arrived alone, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd brought an honor guard. "We push deeper," Russ said, before anyone had formally opened the discussion. "We have momentum. We have 3 legions and the traitors are reconfiguring after Scalathrex. Every day we wait, Perturabo rebuilds. Every day we advance without supply consolidation, we become what Perturabo wants us to become," Dorn replied. "Overextended, dependent on supply lines that run through warp space we do not control. Then we establish control. With what? We have 3 legions, not 30. The Eye of Terror is not a system to be pacified. It is a region of reality that actively resists pacification at a metaphysical level. We can win engagements indefinitely in here and accomplish nothing permanent because nothing is permanent in here." The lion had been quiet through this exchange, studying a hololithic display of the broader Eye of Terror theater with an expression that suggested he was solving a different problem than the one being argued about. "You're both right," he said, "which means you're asking the wrong question." Both Primarchs looked at him. "The question is not whether we advance or consolidate. The question is what we are actually trying to achieve." He deactivated the hololithic display and turned to face them directly. "Russ came here to finish the heresy. Dorn came here to keep Russ alive long enough to do something strategically coherent. I came here because..." He paused with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this. "Because this campaign will define what the Imperium becomes without Guilliman's Codex, and I intend to have a voice in that definition." Silence. "The protocols," Russ said flatly. "The protocols," the lion confirmed. "Not as I originally presented them. Scalathrex taught me something. Improvised unity has genuine value, but it cannot be the permanent solution. 3 Primarchs found a working method through 43 days of crisis. The Imperium cannot afford 43 days of crisis every time it needs coordinated action." He looked between them. "I am proposing a modified version, smaller council, rotating authority based on theater, checks that Dorn will find structurally sound. He placed a revised document on the table. 40 pages this time. Dorn picked it up. Read in silence for 12 minutes. An eternity, given that he processed text at post-human speeds. Then he placed it back down. Page 17, he said. The emergency authority provisions. They're too broad. They're meant to be. That's why they're too broad. Russ looked between them with the expression of a man watching a conversation he understood was important, but found deeply exhausting. Are you two going to argue about page 17 for the next decade? Probably, Dorn said. Then argue about it on the move. Russ stood, reclaiming his flagon. Because I'm going deeper with or without a revised protocol, and we've already established that me going alone is strategically inadvisable. It was not a vote. It was not a formal command decision. It was Leman Russ deploying his most effective leadership tool, the credible promise of chaos, to force movement in a direction he'd already decided on. Dorn and the Lion exchanged a look that contained, somewhere in its complicated depths, the specific exasperation of people who have realized they are going to spend a very long time managing someone they genuinely respect. The three legions moved deeper into the eye. Behind them, on a demon world 3 systems back, something woke in a chamber that had been sealed for a decade. A stasis pod recovered from a loyalist wreck during the heresy and kept as a trophy by a war band that had since been destroyed, registered an internal power fluctuation. Not Guilliman, not yet, but the pod's machine spirit, responding to some deeply embedded protocol that its creators had hoped would never be needed, sent a single encrypted signal through the warp toward Terra. In the Senatorum Imperialis, a receiver that Calgar had installed and most High Lords didn't know existed, chimed once. Calgar read the signal's content and sat very still for a long moment. Then he began making preparations that he told no one about. The signal Calgar received contained 4 words in ultramarine cipher, so deeply encrypted that only 3 people in the Imperium had the key. 2 of them were dead. Calgar was the 3rd. Stasis integrity compromised. Evaluate. 4 words that meant, stripped of their clinical language, that the process Apothecary Empion had initiated in the Medici Bay of the Macraga's honor decades ago was no longer performing as intended. The venom that Fulgrim's blade had delivered, that patient, a mutating compound that responded to every treatment by becoming something new, had found, in the silence of stasis, a way to continue its work at a rate slow enough to evade the pod's standard monitors, but cumulative enough to matter. Guilliman was not dying. He was changing. And if the process continued unchecked, what emerged from that stasis pod would not be the Primarch who had dictated 47 pages of careful, civilizing doctrine. It would be something shaped by a decade of chaos-touched biological revision operating on a post-human genome without supervision or counteragent. Calgar moved with the controlled urgency of a man who had been mentally rehearsing this contingency for years. He did not inform the High Lords. They would deliberate, authorize committees, produce reports, and in the meantime, Guilliman would continue changing. He did not inform the active Primarchs. Dorn and the Lion were deep in the Eye of Terror, Russ deeper still, and extracting any of them would compromise an ongoing campaign that was already balanced on improvised foundations. He informed one person, a tech marine of extraordinary skill named Venatio, who had spent the intervening decades studying xenobiological compounds with a focus so narrow and so deep that he had essentially become the Imperium's foremost expert on a category of toxin that the Imperium officially refused to acknowledge existed. "Can you reverse it?" Calgar asked. Venatio reviewed the bioscan data for a long time. "Not reverse, interrupt. The compound has integrated with cellular structures that can't be restored, but I can halt further progression and stabilize what remains." A pause. "What remains will not be entirely what entered stasis." "How different?" "Difficult to quantify. The cognitive architecture should be intact. Memory, personality, strategic capacity. The compound targeted physiology, not neurology. But the physical changes..." Venatio stopped. "My lord, I need to be honest with you. I don't know what he'll look like when he wakes up. I don't know if he'll be in pain. I don't know if the process of interruption itself will cause secondary effects." Calgar sat with this for a moment. Then, "Do it. There's another consideration." Venatio's voice carried the careful weight of someone delivering information they know will complicate everything. "To interrupt the compound at this stage, I need to bring him partially out of stasis. The interruption process requires biological activity. The cellular machinery needs to be running to accept the counteragent." He met Calgar's eyes. "He will be conscious, briefly and perhaps not fully, but conscious." They brought Guilliman out of stasis on a Tuesday in a medici bay on Macraga that had been cleared of all personnel except Calgar and Venatio. The pod's field collapsed in stages, each stage monitored by instruments that Venatio had spent 3 weeks calibrating for this specific purpose. Guilliman's chest moved first. A breath so long delayed that it seemed less like respiration and more like a reclamation, the body reasserting its fundamental insistence on continuing. Then his eyes opened. They were the same color. That was the first thing Calgar noticed, with the irrational relief of a man clinging to continuity in the face of change. The same deep, immeasuring blue that had looked out at the galaxy and found it wanting and fixable in equal measure. The physical differences were visible but not grotesque. A tracery of something beneath the skin along the left side of his face and neck, subtle enough that it might be shadow in poor lighting. Unmistakable in the Medicae Bay's clinical illumination. His left hand, resting on the pod's edge as he sat upright, moved with a slight asymmetry that suggested the musculature had been altered in ways that hadn't finished settling. He looked at Calgar for a long moment. Then, with the particular focus of a man whose mind had been running even when his body hadn't. "How long?" "Decades, my lord." Guilliman absorbed this the way he absorbed all catastrophic information, completely, immediately, and without visible emotional disruption that might interfere with processing. The Codex. Unimplemented. The legions remain intact. A pause that was not uncertainty. It was recalculation at a scale Calgar couldn't follow. The Primarchs, Dorn, Russ, and the Lion, are currently conducting a joint campaign in the Eye of Terror. They have developed... Calgar chose his words carefully. A working relationship, improvised, functional, contested. Contested, Guilliman repeated. Something moved in his expression. Show me everything. Calgar had prepared for this. He had been preparing for it for decades. He handed over a data slate containing a comprehensive brief, political situation, military disposition, the Lion's protocols, the Eye of Terror campaign, casualty figures, the state of the Imperium's borders, the threat assessments that had been escalating with increasing urgency from a dozen different frontier regions. Guilliman read it in 4 minutes. Then he read it again. Then he said something that Calgar had not expected, from a man whose entire philosophy had been built around the necessity of structure and codified doctrine. They found a way to function without the Codex. It was not a question. It was not entirely approval. It was the precise, complicated recognition of a man who had spent his convalescence, however unconsciously, assuming that without his document, everything would collapse, discovering instead that the people he'd built his doctrine for had found their own load-bearing structures in his absence. After a fashion, Calgar said carefully. After a fashion, Guilliman echoed. He looked at his altered left hand, flexed it slowly. And the Lion's protocols? Structurally coherent, philosophically problematic. Dorn has 17 objections to page 17 alone. For the first time since waking, something crossed Guilliman's face that was recognizably, undeniably human, not quite a smile, the architectural precursor to one. Of course he does, he said. Get me a Vox link to the Eye of Terror and find me a quill. The Vox link to the Eye of Terror took 11 hours to establish. This was not a technical failure. It was the Eye being the Eye, a region where conventional communication had to be threaded through warp interference, demonic static, and the particular electromagnetic hostility of a wound in reality that resented being observed. Calgar spent the 11 hours managing the logistics of Guilliman's return to consciousness, and which involved informing exactly the right people in exactly the right order to prevent the information from reaching the wrong people before the situation was stable enough to survive political interference. Guilliman spent the 11 hours reading. Not just the brief Calgar had prepared, everything. Decade-old campaign reports, political minutes from the Senatorum, intelligence assessments, the Lion's protocols in their revised form, Dorn's 17 objections to page 17, which Calgar had obtained through channels he preferred not to specify, casualty figures, supply chain analyses, Xenos threat assessments from the Eastern Fringe that had been marked urgent for 3 years and addressed by nobody because the Imperium's political bandwidth had been consumed entirely by the question of what to do about 3 Primarchs who kept doing things without authorization. He read Russ's Vox message to Dorn and the Lion. Stop arguing and come help. Bring everyone, and set it aside with an expression that suggested it had told him something important about all 3 of them. He read his own 47 pages last. When the Vox link finally connected, the signal quality was poor enough that voices arrived with a half-second delay and occasional bursts of interference that the filtration systems cleaned into something intelligible but hollow. Dorn's voice came through first, characteristically direct. Calgar, Sitrep. The Sitrep, Calgar said carefully, is that I have someone here who would like to speak with you. The silence on the other end had a quality to it, the particular texture of a very controlled person exerting significant effort to remain controlled. Then Guilliman spoke. Rogel. 3 seconds of warp-delayed nothing. Then, my lord. And in those 2 words, stripped of everything Dorn's voice usually carried, the professional certainty, the structural confidence, the load-bearing steadiness that had kept the Loyalist campaign functioning, was something raw and briefly unguarded. Relief, perhaps, or the exhale of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down. Not yet, Guilliman said, as though he'd heard it. Keep holding. I need to understand what you've built before I touch it. He asked questions for 2 hours. Not the questions of a commander reasserting authority. The questions of an architect examining a structure he hadn't designed, looking for the load-bearing elements, the stress points, the places where improvised solutions had produced something genuinely sound, and the places where they had produced something that looked sound but would fail under sufficient pressure. Dorn answered with the exhaustive precision of a man who had been waiting for someone qualified to ask. The Lion, and patched in after the first hour, answered with the selective precision of a man who understood that what you chose not to say was as important as what you said. Russ, connected last and clearly interrupted from something that involved a significant amount of background noise, answered with the blunt accuracy of someone who had no interest in managing impressions. We're holding, Russ said at the end of his assessment. But Perturabo is building something. In the intelligence teams, the Lion's people, they've identified construction activity in the deeper eye that doesn't match anything in standard Iron Warrior's doctrine. New patterns, something he's been developing in here for a decade without external reference points to constrain his thinking. He's had time to innovate, Guilliman said. While we were arguing about page 17, the Lion said, with the dry precision of a man making a point he'd been holding for the right moment. While everyone was arguing, Guilliman said, in a tone that distributed the observation evenly and left no room for deflection, including me, in absentia. The Codex, as I conceived it, was a response to the heresy's specific trauma, the fear of what concentrated power could become. It was correct in its diagnosis. I am no longer certain it was correct in its prescription. Silence on all 3 channels simultaneously. You're revising it, Dorn said finally. Not a question, not quite approval. I'm completing it, with the benefit of what you've learned and what I've had time to consider. A pause. The Lion's protocols address real problems. They also create new ones. Dorn's objections to page 17 are structurally valid. Russ's instinct about forward momentum is tactically correct and strategically dangerous. All 3 of you are right about something important and wrong about something equally important. This is why we needed you back, Russ said, with the straightforwardness of a man paying a compliment while pretending he wasn't. You needed the Codex completed, Guilliman corrected. I am not the Codex. I am the person who writes it, and the person who writes it has access to information he didn't have before. He looked at his altered left hand, a gesture none of them could see, private and apparently necessary. Perturabo's construction activity. The Lion's intelligence teams. What are they reading as the structural purpose? The Lion's response took longer than usual. Defensive in configuration, not a weapon, something that endures rather than attacks. Another pause. It reads like a fortress, but the scale is... A rare hesitation from a Primarch not given to them. We have not seen construction at this scale since the heresy itself. He's not building a weapon, Guilliman said. He's building a capital. The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones. The understanding arriving at 3 different speeds through 3 different minds, but landing in the same place. Perturabo was not planning a campaign. He was planning permanence. A fortress state in the eye of terror, built to a scale that would make the traitor legions not a military force operating from a hostile region, but a civilization embedded within one, something that could not be dislodged by a campaign, however large. Something that would require not 43 days of siege, but centuries. He had spent a decade building the thing that Guilliman had feared most. Not an army, an institution. We cannot siege what he's building, Dorn said slowly. Not with 3 legions, not with 30. No, Guilliman agreed. Which means we must prevent him from completing it. A pause while something was calculated that none of them could follow at full speed. I need you to hold current positions and send me everything your intelligence teams have on the construction timeline. I need to know how long we have. And then, the Lion asked. And then I finish the Codex, Guilliman said. The real version. The one that accounts for what the Imperium actually is, rather than what I hoped it would be. He picked up his quill. And then we end this. On the construction site in the deeper eye, servitors built from the remains of loyalist Astartes continued their work through the long dark, and Perturabo stood at the center of his rising capital and permitted himself, briefly, the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won, and he had not accounted for the possibility that the stasis pod would fail. He should have. The completed Codex Astartes was not what anyone expected. It was not Guilliman's original vision, the clean surgical restructuring of legions into chapters, the careful distribution of power, the doctrine designed by a man who had watched the heresy from the inside and drawn the obvious conclusion that concentrated military authority was civilization's most reliable self-destruction mechanism. That document had been written in the immediate aftermath of trauma by a mind processing grief at post-human speeds and producing something that was correct in its fear, even if incomplete in its solution. The completed codex was written by the same mind a decade later, altered by Fulgrim's venom in ways that Venatio could measure biologically, but not philosophically, informed by 10 years of watching the Imperium navigate the absence of doctrine and discover, through improvisation and crisis, which of its instincts were sound and which were inherited assumptions dressed as principles. It was 380 pages. the first 47 were Guilliman's original work, preserved intact. The remaining 333 were something new. Dorn read it in 2 days. His response was a single document, not 17 objections this time. 4. All of them to sections he acknowledged were deliberately constructed to invite debate rather than foreclose it, and one of which he withdrew before sending after reading the relevant passage a 3rd time. The Lion read it in 6 hours and sent no formal response. Instead, he appeared via hololithic projection in Calgar's Strategium on Macraga and spent 3 hours asking questions that were not objections, but were sharper than objections. The questions of a mind testing structural integrity, not to find failure points, but to understand load distribution. At the end, he said, "It incorporates the protocols," not accusatory, almost wondering. "It incorporates what the protocols identified correctly," Guilliman replied. "Unified command authority in active theaters, rotating primacy based on specialization, checks that Dorn finds structurally sound." A pause. "And it incorporates what the protocols got wrong. The Council is advisory, not supreme. The legions are restructured, not destroyed, restructured. Smaller formations within legion frameworks, capable of independent operation, but designed for integration." "You've threaded the needle," the Lion said. "I've described the needle. Threading it will take a generation." Russ's response was characteristically immediate and characteristically him. "Looks good. Page 212 is wrong, but everything else is fine." "When do we use it?" Page 212 governed the authority of Legion Masters to initiate unsanctioned campaigns. Guilliman had written it knowing Russ would object. He had written it anyway. The operation to prevent Perturabo's capital from reaching completion was not a siege. Guilliman, working from Macraga through Vox links and hololithic projections, while Venatio's counter-agents finished their work and his altered physiology finished its settling, designed something that used Perturabo's own architectural logic against him. A fortress under construction is not a fortress. It is a collection of vulnerabilities arranged around a future that hasn't happened yet. Perturabo understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire career exploiting the gap between what a fortification was and what it was meant to become. Guilliman identified 7 structural dependencies in the construction timeline that the Lion's intelligence data made visible. 7 points without which the capital could not be completed on any timeline that mattered. Not the most heavily defended points, not the most symbolically significant. The 7 that were hardest to rebuild if lost, because they represented fabrication processes that the Eye of Terror's environment could not easily replicate. Dorn took 3. The Lion took 3. Russ took 1, the deepest, the most heavily defended, the one that required the kind of sustained forward pressure that the Space Wolves delivered better than anyone alive. The simultaneous strikes lasted 9 days. 6 of the 7 objectives were achieved completely. The 7th, Dorn's 3rd target, a void shield generator complex of Iron Warrior's design that turned out to be more extensively defended than intelligence had suggested, was achieved at a cost that Dorn reported in his after-action summary, with the flat precision of a man who had learned to contain grief inside professional language. 4,000 Imperial fists, his finest siege companies. Gone. He reported the figure without elaboration. Everyone who read it understood that the absence of elaboration was itself the elaboration. Perturabo stood in the ruins of his capital's logistical framework and performed his own assessment with the dispassion of an engineer, calculating the structural impact of subsidence. The capital could still be built. The timeline had been extended by decades. The coalition he had assembled, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, elements of other traitor legions who had found pragmatic value in cooperation, remained intact. He had not lost. He had been delayed. But delay, in the context of what Guilliman had just produced, was a different kind of defeat than it had been the day before. Because the codex that Dorn and the Lion and Russ had just received, the completed version, the real version, the one written by a man who had watched the Imperium manage without it and learned from the watching, that document would change things in ways that a setback in the Eye of Terror could not undo. Perturabo read the intelligence summary his agents had produced on the Codex's contents and sat with it for a long time. He adapted, he said finally, to no one in particular. His senior siege master, Harcourt, waited. I designed my campaign around the assumption that without the Codex, the Loyalists would remain fragmented indefinitely, that Dorn and the Lion and Russ would continue finding reasons not to function cohesively. Perturabo set down the intelligence summary. I was correct about the fragmentation. I was wrong about the indefinitely. He looked out at the construction site. Still vast, still impressive, still the foundation of something that would eventually matter. Guilliman watched them fail to cohere and wrote a document that accounts for how they actually function rather than how he wished they would. He stood, began issuing orders for the revised construction timeline. We have decades, he said. Use them. In the Eye of Terror, the traitor legions dug in for the long war. In the Imperium, 3 Primarchs received a completed document and began the complicated, contested, generation-long process of implementing it. On Macraga, Roboute Guilliman looked at his altered left hand in the particular light of a Macragian morning and considered what it meant to build something true in a universe that consumed truth as fuel. He picked up his quill and began the implementation orders. The Codex existed. The work was just beginning. In the end, the Codex Astartes that reshaped the Imperium was not the document Guilliman had intended to write. It was something harder won and more honest, a framework built from the evidence of human and post-human nature rather than the idealized vision of what that nature should be. It accounted for Russ's need for forward momentum. It accounted for the Lion's instinct for information and independent action. It accounted for Dorn's structural precision and his willingness to pay costs that other commanders would refuse to authorize. It accounted for all of them, because it had been written by a man who had watched all of them and learned. The second founding happened, later than history intended, slower than Guilliman had planned, more contested than any official record would acknowledge. The legions were not broken. They were restructured, their identities preserved within new frameworks that allowed independent operation without sacrificing the capacity for unified command when unified command was what the moment demanded. Perturabo's capital was eventually completed. It stood in the eye of terror as a monument to what the traitor legions could build when given time and purpose, and it remained a problem that the Imperium would spend centuries addressing. Some wounds don't close. They scar over and become part of the landscape. Guilliman's altered hand never fully normalized. He wore it as he wore everything uncomfortable, plainly, without apology, as evidence that survival always costs something. The Codex endured, not as scripture, as a living document revised and contested and argued over by every generation that inherited it, which was exactly what its author had intended. In the gap between what Guilliman had planned to write and what he actually wrote, the Imperium found something unexpected, not perfection, something better, something true. The Emperor protects. More stories await.